Well, first of all, hello. Thank you all very much for coming. I know life is busy for everyone, so I really appreciate you all being here. So today I'm going to be a little selfish and do something I don't think I've ever done before as an ethicist. Rather than trying to convince you all of something, I actually need your help trying to figure out something. And I'm serious about that. Recently I've begun to have doubts about something that I never thought I'd have doubts about. I think potentially I've begun to be converted to the cause of something called the prison abolition movement. Yes, really. I really never thought I would be here. And this is basically a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that, in the words of one of its leading advocates, Mariembe Kaba, by the way, you all should follow her on Twitter. Prison Culture is her handle. I really recommend. According to her, this movement takes a, quote, liberatory approach to violence, which seeks safety and accountability without relying on alienation, punishment, or state or systemic violence, including incarceration. So in case it's not clear, prison abolitionists, as they call themselves, differ from others because rather than simply wanting to reform the prison, they want to abolish it. So that means that they believe the prison is just not incidentally, but in its essence. In other words, there's nothing you could do to make incarceration just, according to these people. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, I must admit this is really a surprise to me that I'm thinking this way. I never in my life thought I'd come to doubt the morality of the prison itself. Kind of an institution I always took for granted. It was kind of necessary like air and water. But despite that, I'm stuck. I'm kind of on the precipice. Even as I grow increasingly disturbed by the practice of incarcerating even duly convicted felons, I remain untrusting of alternatives. I think the prison is unjust, but I fear its abolition. So that's what I want your help with today. So I've arrived at this unforeseen moral impasse due to my research into the history of anti-Blackness, which required me to confront the reality of slavery in unsparing detail. And the more I learned about both slavery in general and Black slavery in particular, the more it seemed not ancient, but hyper-modern, not foreign, but familiar. Slavery seemed less a horror we had left behind than a nightmare we are still living. Increasingly, I began to perceive an uncanny resemblance between slavery and the modern-day prison system that extended beyond the fact that both practices wreaked particular havoc on Black people. Perhaps most surprising of all, I began to see myself in those long-dead men and women who insisted on the goodness and rightness or the necessity of Black slavery in between the 16th and 19th centuries. My argument for the prison echoed their arguments for slavery. And also, like them, I was born into a society in which abolition seemed unimaginable, if not impossible. So today I want to turn to the wisdom of Catholic social teaching to help me adjudicate this internal dispute. Now, any of you who know anything about Catholic social teaching may expect that this will be a short talk. After all, although Catholic social teaching sympathizes with many of the prison abolition movement's critiques of our justice system, it strongly disagrees with their ultimate desire to abolish the practice of incarceration and rely exclusively on alternative responses to violence. So Catholic social teaching seemingly stands on the side of prison reform, not prison abolition. But, I argue, Catholic social teaching seems obviously opposed to the cause of prison abolition only because it has so far overlooked or underappreciated the material and symbolic relationship between prison and slavery. In truth, the conversation between the slavery-centered history of anti-Blackness and Catholic social teaching then cannot just go in one direction only. The history of slavery also has something to teach Catholic social teaching. So in comparing incarceration with slavery, I also remind the Church that its own teaching on slavery has changed rather dramatically. In other words, as far out there as impossible as prison abolition seems today, surely the abolition of slavery would have seemed just as much so not too long ago. For most of the Church's history, it taught that slavery was morally acceptable as long as the enslaved person was enslaved for certain clearly articulated causes. Basically, the Church used to think of slavery like we think of prison, right? It's just as long as the person really deserves it, right? Or the person was duly convicted. But beginning a little over a century ago, the Church began to teach that slavery is never acceptable under any set of circumstances. So given the similarity between slavery and the prison, a change in Church teaching on the former requires a dramatic reconsideration, if not outright reversal, of its teaching on the latter. Or at least that's what I want to explore today. Either way, this similarity between prison and slavery shifts the burden of proof away from those who wish to abolish the prison and on to those who wish to preserve it, at least from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. In particular, those who wish to offer a moral defense of the prison from a Catholic social teaching position must locate a morally salient difference between prison and slavery, right? So what is it that actually makes prison different from slavery in a way that makes prison okay, but slavery is bad? Okay. So far my statements may seem unduly provocative or even irresponsible. So let's start at the beginning. In order to measure the similarity between prison and slavery, we have to define our terms. Contrary to prevailing notions, slavery is best understood neither as a condition of unpaid labor, nor simply the experience of unfreedom that comes from being owned by another human being. Nor does unencumbered independence supply slavery's antithesis. Many people possess claims, privileges, and powers in other people. For example, a wife has property rights in her husband. The professional sports owner has the right to trade his star. Okay, so what then is slavery? So as Orlando Patterson, which his book Slavery and Social Death is kind of the go-to for what slavery is. He looked at basically every single society in human history where there was some sort of written record of slavery and tried to figure out what actually is the common denominator that makes all of these culturally diverse practices slavery. So this is where this comes from. So he defines slavery as the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. Okay, so let's describe these characteristics in greater detail. Okay, so first, the phrase violent domination. Okay, this is more than just coercion, right? There are lots of coercive relationships. It's not just coercion, it's actual direct violence, right? So slavery sustains itself through the deployment of direct violence. And again, literally direct violence, which differs from structural violence. Structural violence is a concept that Catholic social teaching has really developed. Structural violence exists and is real, but Orlando Patterson wants to say that slavery, literally like direct violence, like the whip, right? Like mutilation, like beatings, on and on. As he says, there is no known slaveholding society where the whip was not considered an indispensable instrument. Okay, so the second component of Patterson's definition stipulates that the slave's relative powerlessness before her master stems from a unique source. It was always originated or was conceived of as having originated as a substitute for death, usually violent death, either on the battlefield or the gallows. So in other words, the slave, you could enslave somebody who was an enemy soldier, or you could enslave somebody in place of them, being put to death for a capital crime. So purportedly deserving death, the slave then lives only through her master's power. The ideology of slavery figures the slave master not as a violent thief, but a merciful pardoner. Slavery also casts even newborn slaves as criminal bodies. So living only at her master's mercy, an enslaved person purportedly owes him everything and anything. Right? So the slave has only duties and no rights with respect to his or her master. So slavery differs from other forms of domination or social injustice in a third way. It alone renders its victims natally alienated and socially dead. Okay, so in the Americas, this natal alienation extended even to native-born slaves of African descent, as the relationships enslaved women and men forged with each other were never recognized as legitimate or binding. For example, enslaved couples were frequently sold away from each other, and slaves of both sexes often had to submit to sex with their master or overseer or whoever. Nor could enslaved parents keep their children's masters from selling their children to another master in another part of the world or country. And just as parents cannot protect their children, so enslaved children cannot inherit from their parents. Denied a heritage, the slave belonged only to her master. Only the master or those empowered by him could exercise rights over the slave. Okay, so that's natal alienation. Of course, enslaved people have always, made families that were just as emotionally real and strong as any other family, but society did not protect their rights to literally belong to one another and protect the other person and rely on them. So in expelling its victims from socially specific systems of honor and status, slavery further disempowered the enslaved. It therefore becomes its own justification. Slaves are subjected to extraordinary levels of violence because they are uniquely dishonored. They are uniquely dishonored because they are subjected to extraordinary levels of violence. There's this weird thing, I think, that happens in human societies. Rather than people who are victims of violence, a lot of times, rather than necessarily eliciting compassion, a lot of times, that can actually make people hate them more, right? Or people can actually, it makes them seem like they deserved it, if that makes sense. Dishonored and deprived of the protections that kinship and community ordinarily provide, slaves can be used for nearly any task. This is why, according to Orlando Patterson, enslaved people are the ultimate human tools. So unlike inanimate instruments or beasts of burdens, their humanity makes them even a better tool, right? They can perform almost anything. So throughout history, slaves have been used as scribes, skilled artisans, wet nurses, musicians, sex objects, royal advisors, entertainers, soldiers, and manual laborers. Okay. So all iterations of slavery throughout history and across cultures share these aforementioned characteristics in common. But the form of slavery most relevant to our current discussion differs from these other slave systems in one crucial way. It alone became what I call Africanized or racialized. Okay, so in order to understand what makes Africanized slavery, or what we might use to think of as black slavery, right, the slavery that persisted throughout the Americas, we could do well to compare it to the forms of slavery that preceded it. Okay, so in medieval Europe, for example, there were basically 4 legitimate reasons to enslave someone. They were, as I said, they were combatants in an unjust war, as alternative to execution for a capital crime, as payment for debt, or if they were purchased on a slave market. And this wasn't just the social practice, this was, Catholic teaching as well. And sometimes, and Catholic teaching was a little bit kind of fuzzier on this, but at many points throughout European Christian history, non-Christian status also sometimes justified enslavement. So for example, Spanish Christians often kidnapped Muslims inhabiting the borderlands between Christian Spain and the Muslim kingdoms that surrounded it. And this went back and forth, right? The Muslim kingdoms did this to Christian Iberians as well. But in the middle of the 14th century, when Portuguese mariners sailed down the coast of West Africa to the Senegal River and kidnapped more than 200 inhabitants of that region, the rationale for enslavement would begin to change. Rather than a fate that could befall several different types of people for several different reasons, slavery would become a condition that befell only black people only because they were black. Human beings would become enslaved based not upon what they did or what religion they claimed, but simply how their bodies looked. Blackness became the only justification for enslavement. And when slavery was Africanized, it forged a link between blackness and black people and slave status. And this racialization imbued Africanized slavery with a self-perpetuating momentum. It could live on even after slavery was abolished. In this way, the scholar Saidiya Hartman explains, today we inhabit not the aftermath of slavery, but its afterlife. Another historian, David Oshinsky, kind of elaborates on this and says, although emancipation ended slavery, it did not destroy either the assumptions upon which it was based or the power relations that it had put in place. And unsurprisingly, looking back, many white Southerners, and here I'm talking specifically about the United States, could simply not conceive of a world in which their whiteness no longer signaled mastership. So after emancipation, a critical mass of white Americans worked very hard to revive and reinvent this association between blackness and slave status. So to achieve this task, they relied heavily, but not exclusively, on the construct of criminality. Even before examining the post-abolition history of anti-blackness, we can appreciate the fittingness of this tactic. After all, slaves were in a sense criminalized even at birth. They lived under the harsh spotlight of surveillance and the long shadow of suspicion. They were considered incapable of conforming to the norms of society without supervision and correction. They were believed to be habitual rule breakers in need of public punishment, and they were considered dangerous when not docile. If left to their own devices, they would unleash disorder and attack innocent people. So, unwilling to accept black freedom, white Southerners concocted schemes of black criminalities. In 1865, the very year the Civil War ended, the state of Mississippi passed a collection of laws known as the Black Codes. These statutes identified specific crimes for the free Negro alone. Mischief, and these are, I'm quoting like their phrasing here, mischief, insulting gestures, cruel treatment to animals, and the vending of spirituous or intoxicating liquors. Free black people were prohibited from keeping firearms and from cohabitating with whites. The penalty for marriage, the ultimate taboo, was confinement to the state penitentiary for life. Soon, the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas would follow suit. So pretty much the entire Deep South. But at the heart of these codes were vagrancy and enticement laws, which were designed to drive ex-slaves back to their home plantations. So those found with no lawful employment, and I'm quoting from the statute again, those found with no lawful employment shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction fined a sum not exceeding $50. If the vagrant did not have the $50 to pay his fine, which probably, given how much money that was back then, they would not, he could be hired out to any white man willing to pay it for him. These statutes define vagrancy so vaguely that virtually any freed slave not under the protection of a white man could be arrested for the crime. Many of these states passed similar other laws, which similarly stipulated that African Americans could not legally be hired for a job without a discharge paper from their previous employer, effectively preventing them from leaving the plantation of the white man they currently worked for or had worked for before emancipation. Unsurprisingly, in treating black people like criminals, white people could treat them like slaves. In a practice that would come to be known as convict leasing, Southern states began leasing their black prisoners to work for wealthy businessmen on chain gangs, on plantations, and in mines. More than simply amplifying private profits, this practice added millions in revenue to state and local coffers. It lowered the tax rate for average citizens and generated money for public projects like bridges, schools, and roads. Convict leasing picked up where slavery had left off. The South's highly evolved system and custom of leasing slaves from one farm or factory to the next, bartering for the cost of slaves, and wholesaling and retailing of slaves regenerated itself around convict leasing in the 1870s and 1880s. In this trade, sheriffs played the role once reserved for slave masters. They leased black convicts out to private employers and kept a share of the profits for themselves. These laws were justified by widespread belief that freedom had turned black people into dangerous criminals who were unwilling to work. Again, the logic of Africanized slavery remained alive. According to this logic, black people were both unprepared for freedom and undeserving of it. Convict leasing also allowed white people to maintain masterly power over black people. In addition to extracting unjust economic benefits, white people reasserted their political power. Convict leasing served as an incredibly effective tool for intimidating rank-and-file emancipated African Americans and doing away with their most effective leaders. But convict leasing didn't last forever. At the turn of the 20th century, the penitentiary began to replace the convict leasing system. In the South, and I'm talking about the South, there were similar things going on in the North, but I'm focusing on the South for now. The penitentiary in the South was modeled on the plantation in both design and purpose. So consider the Mississippi State Penitentiary called Parchman Farm. It relied upon a plantation-style chain of command in which the Parchman superintendent was akin to the master. He lived at a front camp in a Victorian mansion and enjoyed a small army of convict servants who attended to his every personal need. Also, like the plantation, each field, the prison was divided into field camps, and each field camp was directed by a sergeant or overseer who also lived on the grounds. It was his responsibility to fix the work schedules, discipline the convicts, inspect the crops, and set the daily routine. He in turn relied upon 2 assistant sergeants, also known as drivers, who worked the convicts in the fields, while a night watchman ran the barracks where the inmates lived. And just as slave masters and their overseers deployed the whip, at Parchman, the true symbol of authority and discipline was a leather strap which hung from the driver's belt. Physical violence was the rule, not the exception. The brutal forms of physical punishment employed against prisoners in 1910, for example, were the same as those used against enslaved people in 1840. The post-abolition penal system also echoed slavery in the way that it operated as a race-making institution. For example, in the early 1900s, the state of Mississippi was a little bit more than half black. But the inmates at Parchman's farm were 90% black. This was by design. Police officers, prosecutors, and judges all enforced state laws selectively. White people were arrested and convicted for only the most serious of crimes, and typically only when committed against other white people. For black people, the situation was reversed. They were arrested for the pettiest and most trivial crimes, but they received little protection from actual violence. Violence committed against other black people was almost never prosecuted, even when the alleged offender was black as well. As one early 20th century sociologist put it, the Negro lived largely outside the law. He played no role in making it, enforcing it, or judging those who broke it. The law did not protect him from white oppressors or black criminals. It did not treat him justly in the courtroom or sentence him consistently for his offense. Put another way, the law protected white people from threats both real and imagined, but it oppressed black people. Anti-Blackness was a feature, not a bug. By 1900, the South's judicial system had been wholly reconfigured to make one of its primary purposes the coercion of African Americans to comply with the social customs and labor demands of whites. Okay, so well, of course, you're like, okay, yes, that's horrible, terrible, right, but that was a long time ago. Of course, the question I'm asking now is about incarceration today. incarceration inherently. You say that the era of convict leasing has ended, and most, but not all of these plantation-style penitentiaries have been shuttered. Again, not all of them. There's Angola and Louisiana. There's probably others. But okay, here's where it might get a little dicey. Increasingly, I've been wondering, is the contemporary prison really that different from these precursors? Okay, well, there's the obvious. To begin with, our prison population is still disproportionately black. For example, despite nearly identical rates of illegal drug use and participation in the drug trade between black and white people, black people constitute 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. But even this stunning statistic underestimates the centrality of anti-blackness to our current prison system. While African Americans comprise about 1 in 200 of all known people in the world, African American men comprise 1 in 12 of all known prisoners. And I got that statistic is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. And still, black people receive less state protection from violence than other groups. Black people still comprise a disproportionate share of our country's homicide victims, but still, those who murder black people, including other black people, are the least likely to be punished for that, right? So again, they're like the most punished, but the most protected, or I'm sorry, the most punished and the least protected from real violence. The black mass prison today also restores the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution. So even though inmates cannot vote in every state, I think, but Vermont, which also should set off some alarm bells, right? If the only state that lets its prisoners vote is Vermont, and I think maybe Maine, okay? So even though inmates cannot vote, they are counted as residents of the congressional districts in which they are imprisoned. So these disproportionately black inmates are usually housed in prisons are usually in white and rural districts, right? So that inflates the size of white rural congressional districts, basically giving them more representation in Congress, right? More political power. But the similarities between contemporary practices of incarceration and slavery would remain even in the absence of anti-blackness, right? So even if we fixed anti-blackness, at least I'm going to argue or explore, I think we'd still have a problem. Okay. So first, incarceration resembles slavery because it inflicts upon its subjects civic and social death, right? So for example, a prisoner can file a lawsuit in state or federal court only if she has first tried to resolve her complaint through the prison's grievance procedures. The prison can basically make it impossible, right? So unlike non-imprisoned people, a prisoner basically has to kind of get the cooperation of the prison to sue the prison, okay? So we can see that's not really a great system. And prisoners remain socially dead or kind of in a state of social death even after they leave prison. Former prisoners are denied educational aids like Pell Grants. They are often systematically excluded from social redistribution and public aid. And in almost every state, private employers can deny felons employment with impunity, right? You can even discriminate against somebody who's even just been arrested, right? So, there's like, you can't discriminate against, somebody on the basis of age or sex or nationality, but if someone's a felon, as an employer, you absolutely have the right to say, pass, no matter what, right? So discrimination against ex-felons is legal, and even just people who've been arrested too. And like enslaved people, prisoners are believed to be those who owe society a debt rather than those whom society owes rights. Like enslaved people, they have duties and few, if any, rights. Like enslaved people, rather than claiming rights, they must rely on mercy. And, we have this expression, throw yourself on the mercy of the court. 2, incarcerated people also endure natal alienation. As our own Catherine Geddick, Solstice, and I think I saw her just perfect timing, walk in the door. Sorry, I shouldn't have just done that, embarrassed her. As she says, more than half of incarcerated men and women are parents of children under the age of 18. And unsurprisingly, incarceration severs black family ties much more frequently than it severs those of non-black families. Among white children, 1.75% of white children had an incarcerated parent in the year 2008. The rate for Latino children of all races, again, which remember Latino is an ethnic group, not a race, was 3.5%, so that's roughly twice the white rate. But in contrast, 11% of African American children had an incarcerated parent in the year 2009. I don't even know what to say about that right now. Okay. Like enslaved people, prisoners enjoy family visits only if prison authorities allow them to. The state does not recognize an incarcerated person's full right to a family life. Prisons are sometimes really far away. It's hard to get there, on and on. 3, incarceration further resembles slavery in that it renders incarcerated people extremely vulnerable to routine sexual humiliation, sexual abuse, and rape. So a 2002 Justice Department study found that prison guards accounted for half of all sexual abuse inflicted upon imprisoned people. In the year 2011 to 2012, more than 5% of men in some of our nation's prisons reported experiencing sexual misconduct at the hands of prison staff. In some women's prisons, this rate surpasses 10% in some cases. A 2004 Human Rights Watch report found that, quote, correctional officers will bribe, coerce, or violently force inmates into granting sexual favors, including oral sex or intercourse. Prison staff have laughed at and ignored the pleas of male prisoners seeking protection from rape by other inmates. Again, there's that thing about simultaneously most preyed upon, least protected, right? Preyed upon by the prison staff, but also not protected from other prisoners. Like enslaved people, incarcerated people possess the least amount of power, not just to protect themselves from sexual violence, but also to discipline and punish their perpetrators. And unlike unimprisoned adults, prisoners are really believed to have no consent to give. Rightly so, we're having a big conversation about consent in this country. We need to keep having it. We don't really think that prisoners have the same rights over their own body as other people do. I mean, think of how poorly we do with consent. Non-imprisoned people, it's worse even with prisoners, right? The prison, this is my argument, this might be a little bit strong, I don't know, but the prison also differs from all other institutions in that it alone qualifies as sexually violent by design. Okay, so for example, in prison, institutionally perpetuated sexual violence proves so routine as to be invisible. How often do we cite cavity searches or the practice of guards supervising prisoners while they shower as expressions of rape culture? And it's not like we don't know about this. In fact, prison rape jokes, especially when men are the victims and I guess the perpetrators, are like everywhere in our culture. I think casual conversation, TV shows, family sitcoms, right? The man's going to prison, drop the soap. I mean, I don't want to go too much into those, but I think we all know about them. For also like enslaved people, prisoners are often subjected to spectacular levels of non-sexual violence that are also perceived as routine and well-deserved. I think even more than the sexual violence. So for example, according to a 2016 study, 19% of all male inmates in US prisons say they've been physically assaulted by other inmates. 21% say they've been assaulted by prison staff. In 1999, a federal judge found that Texas prisons were pervaded by what he called a culture of sadistic and malicious violence. In a 2004 report, Human Rights Watch reported, in recent years, US prison inmates have been beaten with fists and batons, stomped on, kicked, shot, stunned with electronic devices, doused with chemical sprays, choked, and slammed face first into concrete floors by the officers whose job it is to guard them. And I know that in mentioning these, I might risk making it more routine. So I hope, my intention is to shock, but I'm realizing the risk here is that I'm making this more mundane. And there's also reports showing that this happens even to children in juvenile facilities too. Okay, 5, back to our own Dr. Catherine Geddick-Solstice, right? So and this is just like the most obvious one, similarity between prison and slavery. She says, the primary feature of imprisonment is the deprivation of personal liberty. Like literally, imprisoned people are not free. Like they are captives, like literally, okay. In a sense, we could think that to arrest somebody, and I'm not necessarily saying that arresting somebody is always unjust, but an arrest is basically like a legally sanctioned kidnapping, right? Okay. And like slavery, 6, like slavery, incarceration stigmatizes. There's actually even been studies, given the racialized nature of incarceration, that, recently, I don't know if you heard, during the Obama administration, they did the ban the box. Anyone heard about this? So the Obama administration said, for federal hiring, for the federal government hiring a job, you could no longer ask about felon status, until further down the line. It couldn't be like the first thing that you knew about somebody. And the hope, of course, was that this would make it easier for formerly imprisoned people to get jobs. Well, something really depressing happened and unexpected. What actually happened is they found that it ended up making it harder for black people to get jobs, because the way that the box, the felon box was actually working was, or at least one can infer from the results, that it was assumed rather than being like, oh, this person's a felon, it basically was assumed that if you were black, you were a felon until I knew you weren't. Does that make sense? So I don't know the state of that now. And I think there's other been things like, white people who are former felons, have better chances at employment than black people who have never been incarcerated. Again, because there's this link, just as there is a link between blackness and slavery, there's a link between blackness and feloniousness or imprisonment today. Okay. All right, now, this is my pièce de résistance here. This is my biggest piece here. But perhaps the most unsettling evidence in favor of my argument comes from the 13th Amendment itself. Okay, so we remember it as the amendment that abolished slavery, but this is not really true. So let's actually read the text of the first, whatever it's called, part of the amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Okay, now, I personally am not quite comfortable equating incarceration with enslavement. I don't really quite want to go there, but I think it's important to notice that the legislative bodies that drafted and ratified this amendment must have thought that slavery and incarceration or other forms of punishment were so similar that abolishing slavery outright would perhaps also lead to abolishing incarceration, right? I think that's interesting, right? They didn't think there was a sufficient difference between the two. They wanted slavery to end, but incarceration to continue. Okay. And an 1871 ruling, again, I'm not a legal scholar. I know there have been a lot of developments, especially since the 1970s, of giving prisoners back some rights, but I still think this ruling is important just to know about. In an 1871 ruling, the Supreme Court of Virginia went even a step further, and they argued that, quote, for the time during his term of service in the penitentiary, a prisoner is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords him. He is for the time being a slave of the state. He is, and this is Latin, civiliter mortis, in a state of civil death. And his estate, if he has any, is administered like that of a dead man. Okay, so there's that social death thing again. Okay, so that's the descriptive. That's my argument for the comparison. Now, I want to, what can Catholic social teaching help us out here, right? All right. So I've kind of already said this at the beginning, but I want to reiterate it. I think that given the similarities between prison and slavery, again, I don't want to equate them, but I think they're very similar. I think the burden of proof falls on theologians and church authorities to locate a morally significant distinction between slavery and prison. I mean, there may be one, but I don't think we have found it yet, at least not consistently in Catholic social thought. So I guess the question then would be, shifting the burden of proof would be, if there is no good reason to enslave someone, can there be a good reason to incarcerate someone? So that's the question that Catholic social teaching would have to answer affirmatively. Another thing too, and this is again, I talk about my kind of personal journey, how I feel. I keep wanting to defend the prison, but then I keep getting unsure of the rightness of my desire. So just again, remember that all of the reasons that we currently put forth in defense of the prison were in one point in history put forth in defense of slavery. Defense of innocent people, rehabilitation, reform, moral improvement, retribution, and preservation of law and order. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the prison's wrong, right? But again, I'm just saying we have to come up with better reasons. Okay, but the structural, historical, and symbolic connection between slavery and the prison provides, or gives us another reason to doubt the moral feasibility of even a reformed prison system. So I increasingly wonder, it seems to me as though the relation between slavery and prison raises the possibility that American penal practices will be anti-black almost inevitably. So in the United States, slavery has been painted black, and if the prison exists as slavery's kinfolk or its echo, if it recapitulates slavery, would not any iteration of the prison system succumb to anti-blackness? Put another way, it seems increasingly likely that anti-blackness is a feature of the prison system, not a bug. It is not a blemish that can be easily removed. It is the beating heart of American conceptions of crime and punishment. The United States has experienced several waves of criminal justice reform throughout its history, but none of them, I'm not trying to say there haven't been improvements or changes. There have been, but none of these have managed to rid our criminal justice system of its anti-blackness. Of course, at this point, one might, again, posit some objections, right? Again, it's still, and like I said, I still struggle with this. We still might say, well, incarceration only violates human dignity when an individual is unjustly incarcerated, right? Or we might say, even if it does violate human dignity, it's kind of an unpleasant but necessary response to sin and violence. But what about innocent people that we have to protect? The good of the offender must be subordinated to the good of the society he or she has harmed. But again, I think from a Catholic social teaching perspective, this isn't enough either, and here's why. I think that recent changes in church teaching on not just slavery, but the closely related topic of torture cast doubt on these rationales. As it did with slavery for most of church's history, it permitted and in some cases prescribed torture. It was not just morally acceptable to torture someone in certain circumstances, it was sometimes morally necessary. And magisterial authorities didn't endorse torture because they didn't realize it was harmful, right? They knew that somebody being tortured was undergoing something horrible. They knew someone being tortured was suffering. But they just simply thought it was, the right thing to do. So, for example, they believed that certain wrongdoers, especially apostates, simply deserved to be tortured. They also believed that torture protected innocent people. It served the common good, and it upheld the importance of truth and the evil of error. In some cases, magisterial authorities, and this is outside of, not just Catholics weren't the only ones, right? And in some cases, magisterial authorities believed that the temporary harm inflicted by torture actually promoted the victim's eternal happiness. Those who were tortured were more likely to confess their sins and be spared the fires of hell, right? Again, this is this is a very super condensed history of torture. But now the church considers not just slavery, but also torture to be intrinsically evil. And that means there's never a situation that justifies them. Not even the ticking time bomb, there's like a playground full of children and there's a bomb and if we need to torture it, no, okay. One cannot torture even suspected terrorists. One can't torture in order to save innocent lives, just as one can't enslave enemy soldiers, not even if they were Nazis or whatever the worst possible soldier you could think, okay. As Pope Benedict the 16th expressed, the prohibition against torture cannot be contravened under any circumstances. Okay, so what changed? Well, first and perhaps most importantly, the world changed due to the actions of enslaved people and abolitionists, both black and white, and to reformers and revolutionaries of all types, the moral common sense turned against these practices. And whatever the effect of these social and political movements on church teaching, the church also has changed its mind about slavery and torture because, I argue, it has changed its mind about human dignity. It's not that it didn't have the concept of human dignity, just said that recently, maybe the past century, I don't know, maybe a little bit longer, it started to recognize new implications to the existence of human dignity. In prohibiting torture and slavery, even for the best of reasons, the church proclaims that there is nothing that a human person can do to forfeit his or her dignity. And now, Catholic social teaching already applies this principle to imprisoned people as well. In a 2000 statement about Catholic pastoral prison care, Pope Benedict, again, articulates this explicitly. He says, public authorities must eschew any means of punishment or correction that either undermine or debase the human dignity of prisoners. Professor Geddick Solstice, again, echoes this, kind of distilling Catholic social thought on incarceration down to its essence, says, prior to determining what is due to a person based on his or her actions, we are expected to provide what is due based on this inalienable dignity. There is a time for rewards and punishments, but it is after we first acknowledge the potential of all individuals to live with the dignity and goodness for which they were created. So, according to Geddick Solstice, Catholic social teaching believes and teaches that if the system does not maintain dignity and does not foster the common good, whatever it is that is happening in our prisons, it is neither just nor virtuous. Okay, so just before we get to answering this question, I just want to point out what this is actually saying. So notice that Catholic social teaching doesn't ask whether imprisoned people deserve to be incarcerated, and controversially, it doesn't, at least when talking about human dignity, okay, it doesn't even care whether prison is protecting innocent people. It obviously cares about that, but it's not putting caveats on the human dignity thing. It sets one minimum standard that cannot be set aside for even the best of reasons. Does incarceration respect the human dignity of incarcerated people? So I guess what I am increasingly convinced of is, especially when I'm reflecting upon the similarity of prison to slavery, I really find it harder and harder to say that imprisoned people are treated with human dignity. So my argument then is that Catholic social teaching currently perceives the prison as morally acceptable only because, or largely because, it has not yet realized the full ramifications of its changing understanding of human dignity. The church, put another way, the church's teaching on incarceration has not yet caught up to its teaching on human dignity. The church began to change its mind about torture and slavery only in like the 19th, late 19th century, which is relatively recently if we measure in church years. And I argue this era of change is still ongoing. For example, it was only with the late 20th century papacy of John Paul II that the church proclaimed capital punishment immoral basically for any imaginable circumstance. And although these statements haven't yet risen to the level of official church teaching, just in the past few years, Pope Francis has compared lifetime imprisonment or lifetime prison sentences to both torture and the death penalty. Again, that's not, it's not like official teaching yet, but it still is quite significant. So, and I would argue that especially in the United States, we know that prison sentences of any length bear an even closer resemblance to the practice of slavery. And that's all I got, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Certainly leave many unanswered questions for us in terms of the future of what Catholic social teaching might add to this dilemma. I have a question in terms of would be appropriate to make the following distinction that someone who is enslaved in the system of slavery is innocent by virtue that they have done nothing to deserve it other than to be born into it, versus someone who actually performs a crime that has devastating effects not on just one individual but on the common good. Can we equate those as similar? It's a question that I have that would distinguish someone who's enslaved and someone who might be in prison. Still, I have the question of whether or not a prison, the way it's conducted in this country, would be appropriate, or are there other models that could be used? As some wardens have suggested, being in prison is punishment enough. The rest of the time here should be something different. That's not universal necessarily, but it is a question, is there a need, and could there be different models and ways of dealing, obviously, with crime?
Yeah, well, so the first one is a really good question, and I've even seen some people, usually people who are African American, but not always, get really upset, in response to prison abolitionists making this comparison, because it seems to say, well, wait a minute, enslaved people in the Americas were innocent, right? How dare you compare, and I think there's real validity to that, and I think there's a danger in this, and I think that's definitely a danger. But I think, well, at least I can only explain my thinking, because I am a little unsure about what I think. But what I realized in learning, that's certainly true for black slavery at a certain point, but especially if we go back, kind of medieval slavery, I guess I'll say I would still be uncomfortable today, for example, if I learned that, I hate using this Nazi, I think it's terrible, but I think that we would also, most of us, be concerned if we found out that after the end of World War II, the United States soldiers got to take Nazi prisoners or Nazi soldiers or Japanese soldiers or Italian soldiers, slaves, and take them back home to the United States as slaves, right? And so I think even if we think of, that's what I say, the most defensible slavery in history, I think we would still be like, whoa, that's wrong. I think another thing, if you look, kind of especially like in the 1600s, when black slavery was kind of still ramping up, there were some, not really as many as there should have been. The ease with which Catholic and Protestant European nations accepted black slavery is like way too easy, obviously. But there was some debate about, well, how do we know these people that we're buying in Africa? How do we know that they were captured licitly? And they said, well, according to doctrine, we're not responsible for the legitimacy of the capture. We're just responsible for making sure that we're buying a slave from an actual slave market. So, yes, I hear you. I guess I would say for me, what's pushed me is learning kind of the deeper history, and again, the history of the slave trade in West and West Central Africa is super messy. I mean, there were people who were captured out of wars. I mean, sometimes wars were started just to produce prisoners of war. There were some cultures that were shipping out their bad guys to the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, of course, people are born into slavery, that's different. But I guess that's where my thinking has gone. In terms of, I'm forgetting your second question, alternatives. I mean, I'm very much at the beginning of this. I don't know. That's why I said, that's why it's hard for me to actually call myself a prison abolitionist, because I don't know, right? I really don't know. It's hard for me to imagine something. And certainly, if you've been a victim of violence or know someone that has been, I mean, that's no, I don't mean to be glib about that. I guess I'll just plead ignorance, right, at that point. I don't know if that's, there's yes, I disappointed you, right? I didn't give you what you thought was.
Yeah. The reason I came today was your thesis was anti-Catholicism, anti-Blackness, and Catholicism.
Yes.
But you
I didn't.
prove your point.
Right, I didn't. I know. Yeah. Well, that's boring. You don't need to know why I sort of changed it, but. Yeah, so do you want me, we can talk afterwards, and we can talk, or I don't know. You want me to prove that the Catholic Church has participated in anti-Blackness right now? I might not be able to. I don't know what.
Oh, but what she said before about America's penal system is very low. There are much more humane systems than America.
Much more humane, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, that's another thing, too, I think I should say. I do wonder, again, I'm at the beginning of this, I wonder here, Norway, I know there are other prison systems, right? And so, I mean, that's the question, in ethics when you're trying to determine, is something unjust incidentally or something unjust in its essence? Certainly, I would have to do a lot more reckoning with the kind of the best incarceration practices as exist in other countries, like absolutely. I mean, so I'll just say, yes, I agree with you on that.
Even alternative justice systems like the Navajos established in 1982, an alternative justice system called Peacemaker Court.
And I remember what I was going to say. Again, I intentionally kind of only gave a very brief description of like the prison abolition movement. But if you research, they do have. They're not just like, oh, someone does something bad, get over it. They believe in something called transformative justice. So they would very much, so it's not oh, let people do what they want. It's alternative means, right? So certainly it would be things like, again, like I said, I haven't done the work on this. But there are people out there. So yes, that's important to emphasize, right? Prison abolitionists aren't just saying, let's get rid of the prison and just, kumbaya, right? It would be alternative justice systems anyways.
During the convict leasing following the emancipation, that seems to be correlated around the same time as the plenary councils that discuss the role of the enslaved population. So were there any literature precedent about any discussion of the rise of convict leasing during the plenary councils? And then the second question is, were there, during mass incarceration, was there any precedent on the bishops discussing the rise of mass incarceration in the United States?
So great question. So Cyprian Davis, have you heard of him?
Yes.
Okay, so he has an article about the plenary council on this exact issue that you should look up. But, so yeah, basically the bishops met, I think, in Baltimore, like 1865, something like that. And one of the things they talked about was, what do we do with former slaves? And it's not a heartening story, so there's your question. It's not a heartening story for those of us. It's not a heartening story. Basically, something that I guess I should preface by saying, every single Catholic bishop and cleric in the South was like pro-Confederate. And the Northern bishops tended to be pro-Union or pro-American Army, but not really a fan of emancipation, right? So we didn't, evangelical Christians, things have changed. There was a legitimate abolition movement among evangelical Christians. Sadly, the Catholic Church really, for reasons not just anti-Blackness, but that was a big part of it, Catholics hated abolitionists, really. And abolitionists hated Catholics too, but that's another story. The bishops basically, they were concerned because, again, they thought, and this is when I say I read defenses of slavery, and I see myself in them, and I get very concerned. They say, oh, if only they would have emancipated these people slowly, like the serfs in Russia, because these people just aren't ready for freedom. And there's other things too. I feel like I'm going on too long. But it wasn't great, basically. They had a very paternalistic at best, if not just very violently racist view. And in the years past, I mean, the Catholic bishops failed in formerly enslaved black people like so dramatically. Yeah. Well, I was actually going to ask, Catherine, do you want to say about the, I'm sorry, I hate to do this to you, but do you want to say anything about what the bishops have said specifically about mass incarceration? Yeah, but great questions.
One question? Yes.
Do you think there's an allocution in line, maybe an apology for scientific racism? I'm just thinking that underneath all of this, like you said, the bishops after there's this idea, the Hamitic hypothesis, the idea of this sort of chain of being about that was sanctioned by not just Catholics, I mean all Christendom, and that idea that's never ever really been revisited with any kind of and it taints the apologies that all come out in countries that have suffered under colonialism and the genocides that might have followed after that. And there's a kind of reticence to embrace the fact that this was a structural racism that was sort of embodied in the colonial endeavor, may have been embodied in the colonial endeavor in the U.S., although I'm really talking more about Europe. But I wonder whether looking back and really trying to embrace that and doing it like we did with Galileo, to say we made a mistake, we got the science wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we followed science, and we really, science should really govern this, the way we think about the cosmos. Science should also really govern how we look at race as a construct. And I wonder whether or not that might, I hope we don't have to wait 400 years.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I know like John Paul II, at least on one occasion, on various trips to West African countries, apologized for the Catholic Church's role in the transatlantic slave trade. I don't know if the Catholic bishops have apologized. I mean, in the United States, not that I know of, but I could be missing something. But I would say, I mean, the general thesis about the Catholic Church and anti-Blackness is we are basically no better than the society in which, whatever the culture is, whatever the rationale, whatever the practice, Catholics, when it comes to anti-Blackness and other forms of racism, the Catholic Church has pretty much been status quo. So I would say, like countries, like other churches, to my knowledge, there has not been a single country, so whether like Jamaica or Ghana, country that was dramatically affected by the transatlantic slave trade, none of them have ever received any reparations from anyone. For example, in fact, Haiti was just until like a few years ago paying France reparations for the property that France lost when Haiti successfully revolted against them. So there have been occasions where slave owners got reparations. There has not been a group of African-descended slaves who have ever gotten reparations. So now, of course, in the Catholic Church, we think money, 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 that's important. Yes, I think actually it's something I talk about in my book, that yes, the Catholic Church owes ecclesial reparations, which wouldn't necessarily be money, but a serious actual reckoning, both at the national scale, but even parish by parish. Catholic parishes were very much at the forefront of white flight from northern and midwestern cities in the 20th century, right? No, we have not done that. And again, that makes us pretty much like the country we live in, right? Yes?
The Catholic Church was the first ones to integrate their schools.
It depends. Sort of, not really.
It's a fact.
Well, yeah, in some places, Father Tom, I know when I was in Florida many years ago, there was a school, Catholic school for whites and a Catholic school for blacks. I was assigned to the Catholic school for blacks. So it was very different then, and that
But at least the church did something for the black people. I mean, it's all the difference in the world between, having a school for black people, even though there's apartheid.
But that's that language of,
No school at all.
yeah, but that, again, that's that language of that they should be grateful, right? That, I mean, that's the legacy of, that they don't have rights to things, they should be grateful, right?
But I think also, as you pointed out, things were done years ago because people thought they were doing it in the best interest. It turns out it was not, like the boarding school for the American Indians and reparations has never come up. But basically, children were kidnapped and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
We have a history of racism that doesn't apply to people of color, but also to the American Indians, et cetera. But it's part of our history, and how do we reconcile with that and recognize that and move on? By the way, Pell Grants are now granted.
Oh, are they done? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome.
It was about
Okay, good.
2.5 years now that it was okay, I think about 2.5 years. So our students
That's awesome.
can have access.
That's wonderful.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Grimes for this stimulating
Yeah.